True crime documentaries you didn't know you needed. The Forgotten Farm, inside Angola prison. Deep in the swamplands of Louisiana lies one of the most infamous prisons in American history, Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola Prison. Built on an 18,000-acre former slave plantation, Angola's nickname, the farm, still carries the weight of its past. What makes this place so haunting isn't just its size, but how much of that old world still exists inside its fences. For decades, inmates, most of them black men, have worked in the scorching Louisiana sun, harvesting cotton, soybeans, and corn under the supervision of armed guards on horseback. These guards are often referred to as riders, a chilling echo of the plantation overseers who once patrolled these same fields. The visual resemblance is hard to ignore. Men in denim uniforms picking crops, rifles glinting above them, no pay but a few cents per hour. Angola houses more than 5,000 prisoners, many serving life sentences without parole. According to reports from the Louisiana Department of Corrections, over 75% of the population is African American, and many were sentenced by majority white juries in rural parishes. Civil rights advocates and historians have long pointed to this as one of the clearest examples of how slavery's legacy transformed into a new system of forced labor through incarceration. In 2013, the New York Times and The Atlantic published investigations revealing the harsh realities of Angola's labor system. Former inmates described waking up at 4:30 a.m. for field assignments that lasted until evening, with minimal breaks and temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Refusing to work, they said, could lead to solitary confinement or loss of privileges. Even more disturbing, inmates assigned to the fields often earned as little as 2 cents an hour, less than $1 for an entire day's labor. Critics, including the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center, have called this modern-day slavery, pointing to the 13th Amendment loophole that allows forced labor as punishment for a crime. Angola's leadership has long defended the program, claiming it provides structure and discipline. In interviews, prison officials argued that inmates learn responsibility through farm work and contribute to the facility's self-sufficiency. But for many who lived it, the experience was one of dehumanization and despair. A former inmate named Robert King, part of the group known as the Angola Three, spent 29 years in solitary confinement and later told reporters that Angola's true horror was not just isolation, it was being treated as a labor resource instead of a person. "We were products," he said. "Not prisoners. Products for profit." Legal challenges have attempted to confront Angola's practices. In 2021, a federal lawsuit filed by several inmates alleged that extreme heat conditions in combination with forced field labor violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The case reignited national debate about prison labor and racial injustice, echoing the arguments of earlier civil rights activists who once stood outside Angola's gate. Despite decades of criticism, Angola Prison remains a fully operational maximum security facility, part farm, part fortress. Visitors who take the official tour often see smiling inmates at rodeos or tending gardens, but behind those scenes lies a daily routine of exhaustion and systemic inequality. The prison's museum even sells souvenirs bearing the slogan, "The Farm. Hard time for hard crime," a grim reminder of how suffering has been turned into spectacle. For those who have walked the fields of Angola, the land itself tells the story. Beneath the crops are the graves of enslaved people and prisoners who died nameless, buried in the same soil they once worked. Their history and labor continue to feed a system that, for many, never truly ended. The police who became criminals, the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force. In 2017, the city of Baltimore faced a revelation so shocking it felt like a movie plot, but every word was true. The very police unit sworn to remove illegal guns from the streets had become one of the most dangerous criminal gangs in the city's history. The Gun Trace Task Force, GTTF, was an elite plainclothes squad within the Baltimore Police Department. Their mission: to track illegal firearms and reduce violent crime. Instead, they spent years robbing residents, planting drugs, and fabricating reports, all while earning medals for their heroic police work. The scandal began unraveling in 2016 when FBI wiretaps and surveillance revealed what internal affairs had long ignored. The unit wasn't stopping crime, it was committing it. Officers including Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, Detective Daniel Herschel, and Detective Mamadou Gondo ran a criminal enterprise from inside the department. They stopped drivers without cause, stole cash, drugs, and jewelry, and even resold narcotics they seized from dealers. According to FBI court filings, the officers used GPS trackers to rob drug suspects, pocketed hundreds of thousands in cash, and turned off body cameras during illegal stops. In one case, they broke into a man's home and stole $200,000, then filed a fake report claiming they had seized only $15,000. Another time, they staged fake crime scenes to justify false arrests. What made the case even more disturbing was how long it went unnoticed. Between 2011 and 2017, complaints poured in from Baltimore residents claiming abuse and theft during police encounters. Most were dismissed, labeled as lies from criminals. But the FBI investigation proved otherwise. The evidence showed that these officers had exploited their badges to terrorize the same neighborhoods they were paid to protect. In February 2017, 7 officers were arrested in one of the largest federal corruption cases in U.S. law enforcement history. During the trial, jurors heard secret recordings of GTTF members joking about stealing money and mocking their victims. Prosecutors called it a criminal gang with badges. The FBI agent who led the investigation later said the unit's actions undermined every legitimate officer in Baltimore. The scandal couldn't have come at a worse time for the city. Baltimore was already reeling from the 2015 death of Freddie Gray, a young black man who died from spinal injuries after being transported in police custody. His death sparked protests, riots, and national attention. When the GTTF case came to light, it confirmed what many residents had believed for years: that parts of the department were not protecting them, but preying on them. After the trial, 8 officers were convicted or pleaded guilty. Sergeant Jenkins, the ringleader, received 25 years in federal prison. Others received between 7 and 18 years. But the damage went far beyond those sentences. Over 2,000 criminal cases linked to GTTF arrests were reviewed, and dozens of wrongful convictions were overturned. Some victims spent years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit because the evidence against them had been planted by dirty cops. In response, the Department of Justice launched a full civil rights investigation into the Baltimore Police Department. Their 2016 report found a pattern of unconstitutional practices, including illegal stops, racial profiling, and excessive force, all tolerated by leadership. This led to a federal consent decree, forcing the city to implement sweeping reforms in training, accountability, and oversight. Even after the convictions, the GTTF story continued to haunt Baltimore. HBO's 2022 miniseries, We Own This City, dramatized the scandal, drawing directly from FBI case files and journalist Justin Fenton's award-winning reporting in the Baltimore Sun. The series didn't need to invent drama; the real story was already devastating enough. Today, the Gun Trace Task Force stands as a case study in how unchecked power breeds corruption. It wasn't just about crooked cops, it was about a system that allowed them to thrive for years. Baltimore residents are still living with the scars. Some have rebuilt their lives after wrongful convictions. Others never got their time back. As one victim said in an interview with NPR, they had the badge, the gun, and the city behind them. Who was I going to call? The police. Inside the riot, the 1993 Lucasville uprising. On April 11, 1993, the quiet town of Lucasville, Ohio, erupted into chaos. Inside the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, SOCF, one of the state's highest security prisons, more than 400 inmates took control of the facility, holding 8 guards hostage and sparking one of the deadliest prison uprisings in U.S. history. The riot lasted 11 days, left 10 people dead, and exposed deep racial tensions, religious discrimination, and decades of neglect behind prison walls. It began Easter Sunday afternoon. According to official reports, the spark came from a seemingly small conflict: mandatory tuberculosis testing. Muslim inmates objected to the tests because the injection contained alcohol, which violated their faith. When prison staff refused to make exceptions, tensions exploded. Inmates overpowered guards in L Block, seizing keys and communication equipment. Within hours, they controlled much of the prison's main compound. What followed was chaos, but not random. Despite the violence, a strange order emerged among the prisoners. Rival groups, Black Gangster Disciples, Aryan Brotherhood, and Sunni Muslims, formed an unlikely alliance to maintain control and negotiate with the state. Their shared demand: improved conditions, fair treatment, and protection from retaliation. State troopers and SWAT surrounded the facility, cutting off power and water. As negotiations dragged on, inmates used televisions and handwritten notes to communicate with officials. The hostages became bargaining chips, and fear spread as some prisoners turned on each other. When order finally returned on April 21, 10 men were dead, 1 corrections officer, 9 inmates. The body of Officer Robert Vallandigham, strangled during the standoff, became the tragedy's most haunting symbol. The aftermath was just as complex as the riot itself. Ohio's government faced public outrage. The Department of Rehabilitation and Correction launched one of the largest investigations in state history. More than 50 inmates were indicted, and 5 were sentenced to death for their roles, including Keith Lamar, Jason Robb, and Sadiq Abdullah Hassan, formerly Carlos Sanders, one of the Muslim leaders who helped broker the truce inside. But controversy quickly followed. Defense attorneys and human rights groups argued that many of those sentenced were scapegoats, convicted on inmate testimony exchanged for lighter sentences. The lack of physical evidence in several cases raised questions about due process. Amnesty International and The Guardian both reported concerns about fairness in the trials, with some witnesses later recanting. For survivors and investigators, Lucasville became a cautionary tale about prison overcrowding and neglect. At the time, SOCF was operating at 160% capacity, with poor sanitation, racial segregation, and little access to medical care or education. Inmates described it as a powder keg waiting to explode. The rebellion also exposed how religion and race intersected behind bars. Muslim inmates felt targeted by policy decisions, while white supremacist groups used the chaos to assert dominance. Yet, for 11 days, those same factions worked side by side, forming what sociologists later called a temporary peace born from shared desperation. Documentaries and interviews released years later, including the 2013 film The Shadow of Lucasville, revisited the uprising through survivors' voices. One inmate recalled, "It wasn't about hate. It was about survival. We were living in a system that treated us like animals, and animals will fight back." 3 decades later, Lucasville remains a stain on Ohio's correctional history. The prison still operates under heavy security, and the names of the men condemned after the riot continue to appear in appeals and advocacy reports. For many Ohio residents, the Lucasville riot wasn't just a story about violence, it was a story about what happens when silence, neglect, and abuse build for too long without reform. As one former corrections official later told the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Lucasville didn't just happen overnight. It was 20 years in the making. The kitchen scandal, Aramark's prison food nightmare, In 2013, several U.S. states made a cost-cutting decision that would soon become one of the most infamous scandals in modern corrections history. They handed over control of prison kitchens and the responsibility to feed tens of thousands of inmates to a private company called Aramark Correctional Services. The promise was simple: save taxpayers millions while maintaining quality. The reality, however, turned into a national disgrace. Almost immediately after Aramark took over food operations in Michigan, Ohio, and Florida, reports began surfacing of spoiled food, maggots in kitchens, and dangerously low food portions. Internal audits and whistleblower accounts painted a picture of chaos: untrained staff, falsified sanitation logs, and ingredients so old that even stray cats refused to touch them. In Michigan, the scandal broke publicly in 2014 when prison inspectors found maggots crawling in food trays and kitchen drains at multiple facilities, including the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility and Parnell Correctional Facility. One officer's report described a kitchen where the stench of rot was overwhelming. The Michigan Department of Corrections, MDOC, confirmed at least 30 documented health violations tied to Aramark's contract in a single year. But sanitation wasn't the only problem. Aramark's employees, many paid barely above minimum wage, were repeatedly caught smuggling contraband, engaging in sexual relationships with inmates, and walking off the job mid-shift. By 2015, more than 150 Aramark workers had been banned from Michigan prisons for misconduct. One former employee told the Detroit Free Press, "They didn't care about safety. It was all about cutting costs. We were told to stretch every tray, no matter how little food we had." The scandal quickly spread beyond Michigan. In Ohio, similar incidents emerged: moldy bread, undercooked meat, and infested storage areas. Prisoners filed grievances describing slime on cold cuts and milk that curdled before it reached the line. When the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction launched an investigation, they discovered Aramark had been substituting cheaper ingredients, sometimes serving leftovers from other prisons to save money. The state fined the company over $270,000 for repeated violations, but allowed the contract to continue. Behind the scenes, financial documents revealed why. Aramark's deals were worth tens of millions of dollars annually. Their government contracts promised savings of up to $14 million per year, making them politically attractive despite the growing list of scandals. Then came the lawsuit. Inmates in Michigan filed federal suits alleging Eighth Amendment violations, claiming the contaminated food constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Families of prisoners began posting photos of what they called rotting slop online, sparking national outrage. Civil rights groups, including the ACLU, demanded independent oversight of prison meal programs, calling the conditions inhumane and unconstitutional. In 2015, Michigan terminated Aramark's $145 million contract, citing persistent problems with performance and sanitation. Governor Rick Snyder later acknowledged the failure, admitting the experiment in privatization had backfired. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of inmates had endured months of unsafe food, and public confidence in the correctional system was deeply shaken. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Florida quietly ended its own Aramark partnership after repeated food safety violations. Even in states where the company still operated, inspectors continued to report systemic quality control failures. What made the scandal particularly disturbing wasn't just the health risk, it was what it revealed about the larger system. When prisons outsource basic human needs to for-profit companies, accountability becomes diluted. The cheaper the meals, the greater the profit, even if it means serving food that would be illegal in public schools or hospitals. A 2016 report from the Marshall Project summarized it best. The problem isn't just Aramark. It's the idea that feeding human beings should be a business model. To this day, Aramark maintains contracts with correctional facilities across the United States, though many now include stricter oversight clauses. The company insists that the majority of meals meet or exceed state standards. But for former inmates who lived through those years, the memories remain clear: trays of mystery meat, spoiled vegetables, and the humiliation of being forced to eat what no one else would touch. The Aramark scandal remains a warning, not just about one company, but about what happens when profit replaces duty in the justice system. It's a story of maggots, money, and moral failure, all played out behind the walls the public rarely sees. Caged silence: the solitary confinement lawsuit at Pelican Bay. For more than 2 decades, Pelican Bay State Prison, located on the fog-covered coast of Northern California, has symbolized the extreme edge of America's prison system. Opened in 1989, it was designed to house the state's worst of the worst: gang leaders, violent offenders, and men deemed too dangerous for normal prisons. But inside Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, or SHU, inmates weren't just punished, they were buried alive in silence. Each SHU cell measured about 8 by 10 feet, with no windows, no clocks, and no direct human contact. Prisoners spent 22 to 24 hours a day alone, their only glimpse of daylight through a small perforated grate above the concrete yard known as the dog run. Meals were slid through metal slots. Conversations were shouted through vents. For many, the only voices they heard belonged to the guards walking the tier. By the early 2000s, more than 1,100 men were held in Pelican Bay's SHU, some for decades. Many weren't there because of crimes they committed inside, but because they were validated as gang members through questionable evidence like tattoos, artwork, or rumors. Prison policy allowed indefinite solitary confinement based on gang association, not direct misconduct. In 2011, after years of hopelessness, inmates launched one of the largest prison hunger strikes in U.S. history. Over 30,000 prisoners across California joined in solidarity, refusing food to protest conditions at Pelican Bay. Their demands were simple: end indefinite isolation, provide basic human contact, reform the gang validation system. The strike captured international attention and forced California officials to face what had long been ignored. The Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR, soon filed a class action lawsuit, Ashker v. Governor of California, 2012, on behalf of SHU inmates, arguing that decades of isolation amounted to cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The evidence was staggering. Psychiatrists and human rights experts testified that prolonged isolation caused irreversible psychological damage: hallucinations, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts. Former prisoners described hearing phantom voices or pacing in circles for hours to stay sane. One inmate wrote, "You start to forget the sound of your own name." In 2015, after years of litigation, California reached a landmark settlement. The state agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement and limit SHU terms to 24 months, except for serious, proven violations. More than 1,500 inmates were released from isolation into general population units within a year. It was one of the most significant prison reforms in recent U.S. history. But the scars of Pelican Bay's SHU system remain. Many former prisoners still struggle with PTSD, anxiety, and social withdrawal. A 2016 BBC News investigation followed several men after their release from solitary. Most described feeling like ghosts in the world. They couldn't sleep in silence, couldn't stand crowds, and couldn't recognize faces after years of seeing none. Officials at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, have since defended Pelican Bay's original design as a necessary measure during the height of gang violence in the 1990s. But experts argue that the system became self-perpetuating, an endless cycle of fear and control. Even today, parts of Pelican Bay operate under extreme restrictions. The SHU still exists, though under revised rules, and advocacy groups continue to monitor its use. The facility remains one of the most secure in the United States, a place where architecture itself enforces silence. The story of Pelican Bay is more than a legal victory, it's a moral warning. It shows how isolation, originally meant for safety, can evolve into institutional cruelty when unchecked. For years, men in those cells lived invisible lives, their suffering hidden behind concrete walls. Only through persistence, protest, and legal action did their voices finally break through. As one former inmate told the Los Angeles Times after the 2015 settlement, "We didn't win comfort. We won the right to be seen as human." Behind bars and betrayed, the rape scandal at Tutwiler Prison. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice released a report that shocked even veteran investigators. It described a place where women were routinely raped, groped, humiliated, and traded for favors, not by other inmates, but by the very officers sworn to protect them. That place was Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, located in Wetumpka, Alabama. For years, rumors of abuse had circulated quietly, whispered among advocacy groups, ignored by officials, and buried in paperwork. But when federal investigators finally entered Tutwiler, they uncovered something far darker than anyone expected. The DOJ called it a toxic, sexualized environment with a history of unabated staff-on-prisoner sexual abuse and harassment. Tutwiler was originally built in 1942, designed for around 400 inmates. By 2013, it held more than 900 women in crumbling, overcrowded conditions. The facility was supposed to be a correctional center, but according to federal reports, it had become a sexualized war zone. Investigators found that male correctional officers regularly coerced women into sex acts, traded contraband for sexual favors, and retaliated against those who complained. Some guards watched inmates shower, made crude comments, or demanded sexual contact in exchange for food, toiletries, or protection. The report described a pattern of systemic abuse that persisted for decades. At least 33 female inmates were identified as verified victims, though advocates say the true number was likely far higher. Many were too afraid to speak out, knowing that the system offered them no protection. One of the most disturbing findings was the complete lack of accountability. Officers accused of rape were often transferred instead of fired. In some cases, they continued working alongside their victims. An internal review revealed that many staff members had never received PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act, training, even though the law had been in effect for years. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, had been raising alarms about Tutwiler since the mid-2000s, calling it one of the most abusive women's prisons in the country. EJI's founder, Brian Stevenson, said in a 2014 interview, "The women at Tutwiler weren't just forgotten, they were deliberately silenced. When those in power abuse that trust, it destroys the very idea of justice." The federal investigation confirmed everything the whistleblowers had claimed. Women described being forced into sex in storage closets and offices, threatened with solitary confinement if they refused, and punished for filing grievances. Some became pregnant while incarcerated, proof of crimes the state initially denied were happening. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division issued a formal finding under the Eighth Amendment, concluding that Alabama had violated inmates' constitutional right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. The report cited a culture of sexual abuse and harassment that has become normalized. Following the findings, Alabama officials were forced to act. The Alabama Department of Corrections, ADOC, replaced the prison's leadership, fired multiple officers, and agreed to federal oversight. Training programs were introduced, cameras installed, and new female supervisors hired. But advocates argued that reform came decades too late for the women who suffered in silence. In the years since the scandal broke, Tutwiler has been cited as a symbol of systemic failure, a warning of what happens when prisons operate in secrecy. A 2019 follow-up by NPR found that while conditions had improved, the facility remained overcrowded and understaffed, with some of the same structural issues that allowed the abuse to thrive. Several of the women later spoke publicly. In interviews, they said the trauma followed them long after release. Many developed PTSD, depression, and distrust of authority. One former inmate told the Montgomery Advertiser, "You expect to lose your freedom when you go to prison, but not your dignity." Today, Tutwiler Prison is still in operation. It remains under federal monitoring, and while new leadership has implemented reforms, the scars of its past are not forgotten. The story of Tutwiler stands as a stark reminder. Behind the slogans of rehabilitation and justice, there can exist systems of cruelty hidden in plain sight. The system that sold children, the Kids for Cash scandal. In the mid-2000s, a quiet county in northeastern Pennsylvania became the center of one of the most disturbing judicial scandals in American history. It would come to be known as the Kids for Cash scandal, a case where two respected judges betrayed the very foundation of justice, selling the futures of children for personal profit. Between 2003 and 2008, thousands of minors in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, were sentenced to detention centers for minor offenses: truancy, school fights, petty theft, even mocking teachers online. The sentences were unusually harsh, often immediate, and without legal counsel. Parents sat in disbelief as their children were handcuffed and taken away for what seemed like trivial behavior. The truth, uncovered years later, was almost unthinkable. Two judges, Mark Ciavarella Jr. and Michael Conahan, had secretly accepted more than $2.8 million in kickbacks from the owners of private juvenile detention centers, PA Child Care and Western PA Child Care. In exchange, they funneled children into those facilities, ensuring the centers stayed full and profitable. The corruption was hidden behind the mask of zero tolerance. Ciavarella, in particular, was known for his tough stance on youth discipline. He often lectured parents about responsibility before sentencing their children to months in detention. Behind closed doors, he and Conahan had struck a deal with businessmen Robert Miracle and Robert Powell, who built and operated the for-profit centers. Every child sent there meant more money in their pockets. The scheme unraveled in 2008, when the FBI and IRS launched an investigation after unusual sentencing patterns raised red flags. By the time the full picture emerged, more than 2,500 juveniles had been unlawfully sentenced, some as young as 11 years old. Most had no legal representation, a clear violation of their constitutional rights. One of the most heartbreaking stories came from Hillary Transu, a 15-year-old honors student who created a parody web page mocking her assistant principal. She was sent to a juvenile facility for 3 months after a hearing that lasted less than 2 minutes. Her mother later told the Philadelphia Inquirer, "There was no justice in that courtroom. It was scripted from the start." Public outrage exploded. In 2009, both judges were indicted on federal racketeering and fraud charges. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the full financial paper trail: wire transfers, shell accounts, and luxury purchases linked to the bribes. Ciavarella claimed the payments were finder's fees, not kickbacks. The jury didn't believe him. In 2011, Judge Mark Ciavarella was convicted on 12 of 39 counts, including racketeering and money laundering, and sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Michael Conahan pleaded guilty and received 17 years. Both men were disbarred, stripped of their pensions, and became symbols of how deeply profit can corrupt justice. The human toll was devastating. A 2014 federal civil lawsuit, Wallace v. Powell, sought damages on behalf of the affected youth and their families. In 2022, a federal judge ordered the two former judges to pay more than $200 million in restitution to nearly 300 victims. While largely symbolic, neither man could realistically pay it. The ruling served as a moral victory for families who had waited over a decade for accountability. The Juvenile Law Center and the ACLU of Pennsylvania later called it one of the worst judicial scandals in U.S. history. Beyond the corruption itself, the case exposed the dangers of privatizing the prison system, where profit incentives can override justice and human rights. It also led to major reform in juvenile court procedures nationwide, ensuring minors are always provided legal counsel and that hearings are publicly recorded. Even today, survivors of the scandal continue to speak out. Many describe lifelong trauma, difficulty trusting authority, and lost years of education. In 2022, a now-adult victim told ABC News, "They didn't just steal money, they stole our childhoods." The Kids for Cash case remains a grim reminder that corruption in the justice system doesn't always look like bribery in smoke-filled rooms. Sometimes it looks like a judge in a robe, telling a child he's doing this for their own good, while secretly counting the profits. From police to predator, the Daniel Holtzclaw case. In 2014, a scandal emerged out of Oklahoma City that shattered public faith in the badge. A young patrol officer named Daniel Holtzclaw was exposed as a serial sexual predator who used his police authority to target some of society's most vulnerable women, poor, black, and often with minor criminal histories. The case would become one of the most disturbing examples of abuse of power within American law enforcement. Daniel Holtzclaw was only 27 years old when the crimes came to light. A former college football player and son of a police officer, he had been patrolling northeast Oklahoma City, a predominantly black, low-income neighborhood, since 2011. On paper, he was an ideal recruit, young, fit, ambitious. But between 2013 and 2014, he began systematically stopping women during night shifts, running their IDs for warrants, and coercing them into sexual acts under threat of arrest. According to the Oklahoma County District Attorney's Office, Holtzclaw targeted women he believed the system wouldn't believe, those with drug records, outstanding fines, or prior arrests. He told one victim he could make her problems go away if she complied. Another recalled that he forced her to expose herself on the hood of his patrol car under flashing police lights. The investigation started in June 2014, when a 57-year-old grandmother named Janie Liggins reported that she had been assaulted during a traffic stop. Liggins had no criminal record, a fact that made her the first credible complainant in the eyes of Internal Affairs. Her courage broke open the case. Detectives quietly began re-examining Holtzclaw's traffic stops and discovered a chilling pattern. Dozens of women matching the same demographic, stopped at night by the same officer, often off camera. As investigators built the case, 13 women came forward with detailed, consistent stories of abuse, groping, forced oral sex, and rape. DNA evidence recovered from Holtzclaw's uniform linked him directly to one of the assaults. He was arrested in August 2014 and charged with 36 felony counts, including rape, sexual battery, and indecent exposure. The trial, held in late 2015, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation. Prosecutors described how Holtzclaw exploited fear of jail, addiction, and poverty to silence his victims. One survivor testified, "He picked the ones nobody would listen to, and he was right until we all spoke." After a month-long trial and 45 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on 18 of 36 charges. Holtzclaw was sentenced to 263 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. The courtroom erupted in sobs and relief. Outside, crowds chanted, "We believe the women." Civil rights leaders called the conviction a watershed moment. For decades, marginalized women had reported sexual misconduct by police officers nationwide, often dismissed for lack of evidence or credibility. Holtzclaw's case forced the country to confront a dark reality. The power imbalance between law enforcement and vulnerable citizens can be weaponized in silence. However, the aftermath was not without controversy. Supporters of Holtzclaw launched online campaigns claiming evidence was misinterpreted, but multiple appeals have since been denied. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction in 2021, citing overwhelming DNA and testimonial evidence. The case remains a study subject in policing ethics courses and Department of Justice training programs. For the survivors, justice came at a steep emotional cost. Many faced public scrutiny and online harassment after testifying. Yet they remained resolute. As one woman told the Oklahoma newspaper after sentencing, "He thought we were invisible. Now everyone sees us." Holtzclaw is currently serving his sentence in an Oklahoma state facility. His name has become synonymous with the breach of public trust, a cautionary example of how unchecked authority can become a predator's tool. The story of Daniel Holtzclaw is not just about one corrupt officer, it's about a system that allowed him to operate undetected for years, until one woman's courage forced the truth into the light. The silent protest, Wisconsin hunger strikes. In 2016, a quiet but powerful rebellion began inside the walls of Wisconsin's maximum security prisons. No riots, no fires, no chaos, just silence. Men refused their meals, one by one, in protest of what they called torture by isolation. Their hunger strike would go on to expose one of the least discussed human rights crises in the American penal system: prolonged solitary confinement. It started at Waupun Correctional Institution, one of Wisconsin's oldest prisons, built in 1851. By the mid-2010s, it had become notorious for its use of long-term segregation, what inmates called the hole. Some prisoners were kept there for months or even years, confined in small, windowless cells for 23 to 24 hours a day. They had no personal contact, limited reading materials, and virtually no sunlight. Meals were often served cold through a slot in the door. In June 2016, several prisoners, including Laren McKinley, Rashid Ali, and Cesar DeLeon, began refusing food, demanding reforms to Wisconsin's use of solitary confinement. They accused the Department of Corrections, DOC, of violating the Eighth Amendment, arguing that extreme isolation caused severe psychological damage and amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Their demands were clear: limit solitary confinement to no more than 15 days, following international standards set by the United Nations Mandela Rules. End the use of disciplinary Nutriloaf, a tasteless food brick used to punish hunger strikers. Improve medical and mental health care access for segregated inmates. The DOC initially denied the existence of a hunger strike. But as the days passed, reports began leaking out through letters and advocacy groups like the Wisconsin Resource Center and the ACLU of Wisconsin. By the third week, more than a dozen inmates across Waupun and Columbia Correctional Institution had joined the strike. Some had gone without food for over 30 days. Journalists from Wisconsin Watch obtained letters from participants describing the agony of their protest. One wrote, "They've taken everything, my books, my pictures, my words. This hunger strike is all I have left to show I'm still human." Medical staff began force-feeding some inmates under court orders, a controversial measure criticized by human rights organizations. The ACLU called it a brutal silencing tactic, arguing that the state was trying to suppress the protest instead of addressing the underlying conditions. By late 2016, the strike had drawn national attention. Editorials in The Guardian and The Nation highlighted Wisconsin as one of several U.S. states where solitary confinement practices were being legally challenged. Civil rights attorneys pointed out that the average time in isolation in Wisconsin exceeded 200 days, compared to the UN's recommendation of a maximum of 15. The pressure eventually forced change. In 2017, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections implemented new administrative rules limiting segregation to shorter durations for most offenses. They also reclassified some disciplinary separation units into restrictive housing, with improved mental health monitoring and out-of-cell time. Though not a complete victory, the reforms were a direct result of the visibility generated by the hunger strike. For those who participated, the price was high. Many were punished with further isolation or denied visitation right. Yet, they viewed their suffering as a necessary sacrifice to force the system to listen. In a follow-up interview years later, one of the hunger strikers, Cesar De Leon, told Wisconsin Watch, "We weren't trying to destroy anything. We were trying to live. You can't fix something if no one knows it's broken." To this day, Wisconsin continues to face scrutiny for its handling of solitary confinement. Advocacy groups report that over 1,000 inmates statewide still experience extended isolation periods annually. The state insists conditions have improved, but letters from current prisoners tell a more complicated story. The 2016 hunger strikes weren't televised or widely covered. There were no crowds or viral footage, just starving men in small cells, making the only protest left available to them silence. And in that silence, they forced a nation to confront how far corrections can drift from humanity. Profits over people, the rise of private prisons. For decades, the U.S. prison system has been driven by one word that was never supposed to define justice: profit. What began as a temporary measure to handle overcrowded prisons quietly evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry, where the number of inmates became directly tied to corporate revenue. This is the story of how incarceration turned into a business, and how that business reshaped the meaning of punishment in America. The modern private prison era began in 1983, when a company called Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, now known as CoreCivic, signed its first contract to operate a facility in Tennessee. The pitch to state governments was irresistible. Private companies would run prisons cheaper and more efficiently than the government. The idea spread quickly. By the 1990s, states facing rising incarceration rates and tough-on-crime policies began outsourcing entire prison systems to private operators. Alongside CoreCivic, another giant emerged, the GEO Group, originally Wackenhut Corrections. Together, these two corporations would come to dominate the American corrections market, managing hundreds of facilities and housing tens of thousands of inmates nationwide. At their peak, private prisons held about 8% of the total U.S. prison population, or roughly 120,000 people, according to data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. The problem wasn't just privatization itself, it was the profit motive that came with it. Companies were paid per occupied bed, creating a direct financial incentive to keep facilities full. Some contracts even contained occupancy guarantees, requiring states to maintain prisons at 90% capacity or higher, regardless of actual crime rate. Critics argued that this encouraged policies that prioritized incarceration over rehabilitation. Investigations by the Marshall Project, Reuters, and the New York Times exposed widespread cost-cutting that led to dangerous conditions. Inmates reported undertrained staff, inadequate medical care, and high rates of assault. In 2016, a Justice Department review found that private prisons had higher levels of violence and contraband than publicly run ones. Even so, companies continued to win lucrative contracts, often through heavy lobbying and political donations. Between 2000 and 2016, CoreCivic and GEO Group spent over $10 million lobbying lawmakers and donated to campaigns that supported stricter sentencing laws. Critics say those investments paid off. During the same period, the number of people incarcerated in private facilities grew by 45%, even as national crime rates drop. The controversy reached the federal level under the Obama administration. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice announced plans to phase out the use of private prisons, citing safety concerns and lack of cost savings. But just 1 year later, under a new administration, the policy was reversed. Contracts were renewed and private facilities continued operating, especially those housing federal immigration detainees through ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. By 2020, over 80% of ICE detainees were held in privately operated centers, many run by the same companies that manage state prisons. Reports from watchdog groups described overcrowded cells, inadequate medical care, and unsanitary conditions, echoing the same issues found in earlier state-run scandals. The profit model didn't stop at walls and fences. A growing number of private companies now manage electronic monitoring systems, prison commissaries, and inmate phone services, industries worth billions collectively. Critics argue that this has turned nearly every aspect of incarceration into a revenue stream. Despite years of reform efforts, the economic structure remains largely unchanged. When President Joe Biden signed an executive order in 2021 to reduce federal reliance on private prisons, companies simply shifted focus, expanding contracts with state governments and ICE, where the order had limited reach. Defenders of private prisons argue they provide essential capacity and reduce costs to taxpayers. But multiple state audits have found the savings minimal, often offset by higher rates of recidivism and civil rights lawsuits. In 2023, CoreCivic reported more than $1.8 billion in annual revenue, largely from taxpayer-funded contracts. For many Americans, the story of private prisons isn't about management or efficiency, it's about a moral contradiction. In a system where human freedom generates profit, rehabilitation can never be the priority. The more people locked away, the more money is made. As one former federal warden told the Marshall Project, when punishment becomes a business, justice becomes a commodity. The rise of private prisons shows that America's incarceration crisis isn't just a policy failure, it's a market success story built on human suffering. And until profit is separated from punishment, the system will continue to reward the wrong kind of success. Story sources: Bureau of Justice Statistics, 2019 Prisoners in the United States, The Marshall Project, 2016 Private Prisons, Public Scandal, Reuters, 2020 Inside the Profitable World of U.S. Prison Contracts, U.S. Department of Justice, 2016 Office of Inspector General Report on Private Prisons, New York Times, 2021 Biden moves to end private prison contracts, but loopholes remain.